A spacecraft reached Mars, transmitted one of the mission's most debated images, and then stopped responding before anyone could verify what it had seen. That contradiction still survives in the archive. A shadow-like shape appears in the transmitted frame. The image remains. The witness does not. According to the National Space Science Data Center Mission Archive, Phobos 2 successfully entered orbit around Mars and conducted operations there before contact was permanently lost in late March of 1989. The evidence arrived. The explanation never did. When Phobos 2 reached Mars, it carried more than instruments and cameras. It carried the Soviet Union's last remaining chance to complete a mission that had already suffered one major loss. Its sister spacecraft, Phobos 1, had disappeared months earlier after an erroneous command sequence. By the time Mars filled the view ahead, everything depended on a single surviving spacecraft. That dependency mattered because Phobos 2 had finally achieved what the mission was built to do. It entered orbit. It began observations. Antennas on Earth continued receiving data. The long journey had worked. For a moment, the story looked like a recovery. The surviving spacecraft was approaching the most important phase of its mission. And then it transmitted the image that would outlive it. The frame itself is not dramatic at first glance. Mars occupies part of the scene. Nearby appears a dark, elongated feature often described as shadow-like. The image enters the scientific record as data, not as folklore. It is simply another observation returned from a spacecraft carrying out its work. The important question is not what the object was. The important question is what the next observation would have shown. Because a single image rarely explains itself. Images gain meaning through repetition, through different angles, through additional measurements, through context gathered before and after the moment they were captured. Phobos 2 still possessed the ability to provide that context, at least for a little while. The mission plan contained future opportunities, additional observations, encounters around Mars and its moon Phobos, measurements from instruments designed to examine the environment in greater detail. The image was not supposed to stand alone. It was supposed to become part of a growing chain of evidence. That chain never formed. And this is where the story begins to narrow. Not because the image becomes stranger, because the opportunities to understand it begin disappearing. Ahead lay planned flybys and scientific operations that could have supplied comparison data. Different viewing conditions, different measurements, different chances to determine whether the shadow-like feature represented an imaging artifact, a surface-related phenomenon, or something more ordinary that lacked immediate context. Each future activity represented another possible answer. Each depended on the spacecraft remaining healthy. The mission still had options. But now, those options had become fragile. The race was no longer toward discovery. It was toward preservation. Then, the witness started changing. Engineers began seeing signs that all was not well. Communication became increasingly concerning. Responses were no longer something that could be taken for granted. The spacecraft still existed. It still orbited Mars. But the ability to ask questions and reliably receive answers was becoming less certain. From Earth, the situation looked increasingly uncomfortable. The image remained safely transmitted. The machine that could explain it did not. Every interruption now carried a larger risk. Future observations, future measurements, and future comparisons all depended on a spacecraft that was becoming harder to reach. Then, in late March of 1989, contact was lost. Not temporarily, permanently. At that moment, the investigation changed. Until then, there had still been a future. After contact ended, there was not. The observations that might have clarified the image would never occur. The most visible loss was the spacecraft itself. The larger loss was everything the spacecraft had not yet done. Mission plans contained objectives that now existed only as plans. Scientific operations around Phobos could no longer occur. Additional observations vanished before they happened. Measurements that might have strengthened one explanation or weakened another would never enter the record. The shadow-like image inherited all of those missing futures. People often imagine uncertainty as a lack of information. This was different. Information existed. The problem was that future information did not. Every canceled observation widened the distance between the surviving image and any confident explanation. Independent confirmation disappeared. Repeat observations disappeared. Instrument clarification disappeared. One by one, the pathways leading towards certainty were removed. Recovery efforts continued. But recovery requires something willing to answer. Phobos 2 remained silent. Eventually, the mission crossed an invisible boundary. It was no longer an active spacecraft. It became evidence. Today, investigators do not examine a functioning machine. They examine a frozen archive. The image survives. Mission reports survive. Scientific publications survive. Records of operations around Mars survive. What does not survive is the ability to ask the spacecraft what happened next. That absence has encouraged decades of speculation. Some people looked at the image and saw extraordinary possibilities. Others dismissed it immediately as the product of a failing spacecraft. Neither position fully resolves the contradiction. A malfunctioning spacecraft can produce anomalies. That is true. Yet the surviving records do not conclusively explain the image either. The easy answer turns out to explain less than it first appears. The image remains in the archive not because it defeated investigation, but because investigation lost its future. In the end, the most important object in this story is not the shadow-like feature at all. It is the missing sequence of observations that never followed it. The opening contradiction still remains. A spacecraft reached Mars successfully. It returned evidence. Then it disappeared before anyone could determine exactly what that evidence meant. The image survives because it was transmitted in time. The explanation vanished with the spacecraft that might have provided it. What remains is not simply a strange frame from Mars. It is a single surviving observation, surrounded by all the observations that never had the chance to exist.